The macroeconomic defense bluff. The United States military assumed they could simply spend their way to victory over Europe, but they flew directly into a calculated financial trap. Washington was pouring $250 into every single four-engine B-17 Flying Fortress leaving the tarmac. On the other side of the English Channel, Germany countered by mass-producing 3.46-inch flak guns for a tiny fraction of that cost. The Krupp factories in Essen bypassed traditional market pressures by shifting their entire manufacturing infrastructure onto a ruthless forced labor system. Millions of starving prisoners of war and displaced civilian laborers built these heavy weapons under the constant threat of instant execution. When Berlin ran out of veteran soldiers to fire them, they pulled 200,000 high school boys, children as young as 15 years old, out of classrooms to handle the heavy shells. This meant American taxpayers were draining their domestic wealth on precision aerospace engineering, while Germany fought back with stolen industrial steel and teenagers. Krupp didn't even pay for their raw materials since they plundered the iron ore directly from the mines of occupied France and Poland. Make sure to hit that subscribe button right now to follow our deep tactical breakdowns of the hidden mechanics behind major historical conflicts. This cheap steel and forced labor network simply wore down America's industrial advantage through relentless financial attrition. The Flak 88 UNVAR Kinetic Edge. The weapon that broke the spine of Allied armor began its life staring blankly at the clouds, totally unrelated to ground combat. This was the 3.46-inch Flak 36. Its raw engineering boasted a lethal muzzle velocity exceeding 20,600 foot per second. It sat on a heavy cruciform platform known as the Kreuzlafett, giving a well-trained four-man crew the ability to pivot the entire 12,000-pound weapon a full 360 degrees in less than 20 seconds. British and Soviet tank commanders found out about this capability the hard way. During the chaos at Arras and across the frozen expanses of the Russian steppe, German infantry lines were blindsided by heavy armor. Out of desperation, high commands ordered anti-aircraft crews to drop their long barrels into a negative angle, pointing directly at oncoming vehicles. The physical destruction was absolute. At a distance of 1,100 yards, the kinetic energy delivered by a single 19-pound armor-piercing projectile was so immense it completely detached the heavy turrets from Soviet KV-1 tanks. Allied tanks were literally obliterated before their own 75mm guns could even crawl into firing range. This anti-aircraft asset evolved into the most feared flat-trajectory weapon on the ground. Berlin possessed a long-range sniper that dissolved heavy steel plate like paper, changing the battlefield rules of direct fire engagement. It meant a defensive air weapon could double as an offensive monster, rescuing entire army groups from total encirclement. The Eskai inside the mind, an unpressurized aluminum fuselage flying through sub-zero temperatures at 25,000 foot, was a brutal environment for combat. The physical fragmentation of steel was only half the objective. The true destruction happened inside the brains of American aircrews. Airmen dreaded the heavy, oil-black puffs of exploding high explosives far more than the deadliest Luftwaffe fighter attacks. Military doctors documented a severe mental breakdown they named Flak Happy. It was an acute neurological collapse where veteran pilots lost control of their basic motor skills. When a 20-pound shell detonated near the aircraft's skin, it sent thousands of jagged metal splinters slicing through the thin cockpit walls. The auditory environment alone killed military efficiency. The relentless metal-on-metal drumming of shrapnel ripping through the floorboards right beneath a co-pilot's boots caused immediate, permanent psychological damage. Men who had survived dozens of conventional infantry firefights on the ground would instantly panic, break down, or freeze into catatonic silence while holding the control wheel. German anti-aircraft doctrine recognized a crucial combat reality. A weapon does not need to physically incinerate a heavy bomber to eliminate it from the theater. If you can systematically destroy the nervous system of the human beings operating the machinery, the machine crashes on its own. This invisible trauma effectively hollowed out the enemy's elite pilot pools from the inside out. The Norden bombsight ballistic collapse. Heavy anti-aircraft networks won their biggest strategic victories without achieving a single confirmed kill. The entire mechanics of Allied strategic bombing relied on the highly classified Norden bombsight, a mechanical computer that cost more to develop than the atomic bomb. This complex device required an incredibly stable, level flight path at a fixed altitude to drop a payload with real accuracy. Germany neutralized this multi-million-dollar technology by deploying dense rings of heavy batteries around tactical industrial zones. The defensive fire forced the United States Army Air Forces to violently alter their combat formations, raising their standard bombing altitude from 20,000 feet to a dangerous 26,000 feet. At that extreme altitude, atmospheric physics took over the fight. The circular error probable expanded exponentially because relentless 90-mile-per-hour jet stream winds caught the falling 500-pound general-purpose munitions, shoving them thousands of yards away from the intended target. A mission organized to wipe out a single ball-bearing factory turned into a desperate drop that scattered high explosives across vacant farmlands. The defense didn't need to strip the wings off an American bomber fleet to protect the Reich's industrial infrastructure. They simply changed the vertical geometry of the sky, turning precision air operations into a total waste of expensive Allied munitions. This simple forced elevation neutralized America's finest targeting technology without firing a single accurate shot. If you're finding these hidden advantages fascinating, feel free to subscribe for more breakdowns like this. Day-night escort handoff. Ground artillery batteries and interceptor aircraft over occupied Europe did not operate as separate entities. They functioned as a tightly coordinated defense network. The jagged steel fragments from a near-miss flak detonation did not need to create an immediate fireball in the sky. Instead, the real damage was a slow, mechanical unraveling that sliced hydraulic lines, shattered instrument panels, or punctured an outer wing fuel tank. This minor structural degradation instantly robbed a heavy British Lancaster bomber of its crucial cruising speed. The crippled machine would immediately lag behind the packed protective geometry of the Royal Air Force bomber stream. Aircrews had a dark name for these isolated planes: stragglers. As soon as a straggler dropped away from the pack, the ground-based searchlights and heavy guns would deliberately cease firing at it. This sudden silence signaled the specialized Luftwaffe night fighter squadrons waiting in the surrounding dark. Modified Messerschmitt twin-engine fighters would slip directly into the blind spot underneath the bomber's unarmored belly, deploying upward-angled Schräge cannons to saw the wings off without ever exposing themselves to defensive fire. This lethal handoff between ground batteries and night fighters turned every minor shrapnel wound into a guaranteed death sentence, ensuring that even slightly damaged aircraft were systematically liquidated before ever reaching safety. By utilizing ground flak as an automated wounding mechanism rather than a primary killer, Germany allowed its night fighter fleet to mop up the residual chaos with absolute impunity, maximizing Allied crew casualties while keeping their own interceptor losses remarkably close to zero during peak operational months. The integrated radar weapon. The Third Reich revolutionized modern warfare by transforming air defense from a chaotic guessing game into a structured, nationwide machine. This integrated wall was the Kammhuber line, a massive defensive lattice partitioned into precise geographical grids known as Himmelbett. Each sector acted as an automated killing box managed by a dedicated ground control hub. An early warning Freya radar installation scanned the horizon, picking up incoming bomber formations from dozens of miles away. The exact tracking data was immediately transferred to a pair of shorter-range Würzburg radar dishes. One Würzburg locked its mechanical eye entirely onto the targeted enemy bomber, calculating altitude and speed with surgical precision. The second Würzburg dish tracked a single German night fighter circling at a designated radio beacon inside the same sector. ground controllers read both radar returns simultaneously, verbally steering the interceptor directly onto the tail of the blind enemy plane. This defensive network was so efficient during the early phases of the air war that British Bomber Command faced unsustainable double-digit attrition rates on a weekly basis. The sheer mathematical lethality of this integrated matrix forced Great Britain to abandon individual tactical routing entirely, inventing the massive single-file bomber stream solely to oversaturate and jam the internal processing speed of Germany's ground operators, altering Allied air doctrine through defensive technology alone. This mechanical system eliminated human error. It forced Britain to fly hundreds of aircraft in tight, hazardous columns just to overwhelm a single radar room. Industrial tax. The true impact of anti-aircraft artillery cannot be measured by physical wreckage on the ground, because its real target was the Allied industrial war economy. Washington and London were forced to divert immense portions of their manufacturing capacity away from frontline weapons just to bypass the German high-explosive gauntlet. The financial cost of fighting the flak network was astronomical. Allied factories had to manufacture billions of specialized aluminum foil strips, code-named window, cut precisely to match the exact operating wavelength of Würzburg radars. Entire heavy bombardment groups were pulled from offensive duties and packed with expensive transmitters to form radar-jamming escort wings. The structural design of the bombers themselves suffered under this heavy drain. Aviation engineers had to bolt up to 500 pounds of heavy steel armor, plating around cockpit floors and crew positions, which directly stripped each aircraft of its corresponding payload capacity for high explosives. Every pound of defensive weight added to a B-17 was a pound of offensive ordnance left behind on a hangar floor in England. This financial and material drain functioned as a massive burden that steadily strained the Allied war effort, forcing the United States to expend historic sums of industrial capital merely to keep its existing bomber fleets survivable over Europe, effectively transforming Germany's defensive guns into a parasite feeding directly on America's production lines. The Pentagon was bleeding massive amounts of high-grade engineering resources, timber, and fuel on support fleets, radar detection gear, and defensive countermeasures that contributed absolutely nothing to the physical destruction of German ground positions. Geopolitical Ruiner Anchor. The massive concentration of air defense artillery inside Germany changed the landscape on distant battlefields without firing a single shot at them. To protect their heavy bomber fleets from being totally wiped out by ground fire, Washington had to chain their absolute best tactical aircraft to Western Europe. Thousands of P-51 Mustangs and P-47 Thunderbolts were locked into rigid escort duties instead of attacking frontline enemy positions elsewhere. This specific deployment created a massive resource vacuum across the rest of the world. Hundreds of thousands of expert mechanics, specialized repair machinery, and high-octane fuel reserves were permanently stuck in England, contributing absolutely nothing to the agonizingly slow ground campaign in Italy. Even worse, this forced allocation starved the Pacific theater of essential air assets, significantly delaying the brutal island-hopping operations against the Japanese Empire. The deployment records show that the Allies maintained a 7-to-1 fighter ratio in the West purely for bomber escort, vastly limiting the numbers available to support the Soviet advance on the Eastern Front. The strategic weight of these batteries effectively paralyzed Allied global flexibility. Air forces that should have been hunting down panzer divisions or burning out enemy logistics hubs were instead forced to act as airborne shields. By forcing the Allies into this massive strategic misdirection of resources, the flak network single-handedly bought invaluable breathing room for exhausted German army groups facing total encirclement on the Russian plains, the industrial foil sanctuary. Allied bombing accuracy completely fell apart whenever missions targeted the high-value industrial hubs producing Germany's synthetic fuel supply. At the massive lunochemical plants, individual anti-aircraft guns didn't rely on human guesswork or manual tracking. They were wired directly into a complex mechanical analog computer called the Kommandogerät. This heavy device instantly calculated exact altitude, air density, and target speed, automatically feeding precise fire solutions to hundreds of heavy barrels. The physical guns were only the first half of the defensive system protecting the infrastructure. The Germans surrounded these vital manufacturing zones with thousands of chemical smoke generators. Within minutes of a radar warning, these machines filled the air with a dense blanket of artificial fog covering dozens of square miles. American bombardiers looked through their glass scopes and saw absolutely nothing but a solid, featureless gray carpet that erased every single geographical landmark. During the high-stakes campaigns of 1943, this combination of mechanical tracking and total visual blackout dropped Allied precision bombing accuracy to less than 1% over the Ruhr Valley. This meant that even if a formation of 300 aircraft dropped thousands of tons of explosives, the actual damage to the fuel infrastructure was negligible. Fragile oil refineries effectively became untouchable sanctuaries hidden in plain sight. The Allies were forced to dump millions of pounds of expensive explosives blindly into empty fields and forest lines, leaving Germany's military-industrial infrastructure intact and allowing their factories to keep pumping out weapons to the front. That price of manchacred time. The actual performance of the German air defense network leads straight to a grim conclusion. This entire system was built to manufacture time. Flak batteries were never going to win the war on their own, but they successfully drained the momentum of the Allied strategic bombing campaign. This forced friction and degradation of Allied efficiency bought the crumbling Reich an estimated 6 to 12 months of extra existence. During that critical manufactured delay, German engineers found the exact window they needed to turn experimental designs into operational battlefield weapons. They finalized the mass production lines for the Messerschmitt Me 262, the world's first operational jet fighter, and rushed thousands of V-1 cruise missiles and V-2 ballistic rockets onto the assembly tracks to strike London. The extension of the war did not alter the final geopolitical outcome, but the bill paid on the ground was devastating for the infantry forces. Every single month manufactured by the Flak network forced Allied infantry divisions to attack heavily reinforced defensive lines, directly causing the deaths of over 60,000 additional frontline soldiers. The entire network operated like a massive industrial parasite attached to the Allied advance. It sustained the gasping breath of a dying regime, giving the Wehrmacht enough time to draft new divisions and fortify ground positions. If you learned something new from this investigation, please hit that subscribe button to join our growing community of history enthusiasts. Germany paid for those extra months of structural survival with the blood of an entire generation of young men on the ground.